Hi, I'm Terry. So today I'd like to show you how I do crumb quilt and quilt as you go and do a little bit of couching on top of that to make a really unique piece of fabric that you can use in a tote bag or just bind it as a quilt or make whatever you want out of it. So if you'd like to see how I do this, stick around and I'll show you how. To start with, I have a piece of batting that's 23 inches by 14. And I have a piece of muslin for the back. And this isn't going to be the lining. This is just so we're not sewing straight on the batting because this is pretty fuzzy and it gets stuck in the sewing machine when you sew directly on it. It's just personal preference. I like to have something thin on the back. I think it makes it easier to sew and I don't have to clean out the bottom of my machine so often. I have a lot of half square triangles left over from a tote bag that I made in another video. So I want to use these up, and I'll probably end up cutting these up, and so they're going to look completely different. I also have a few squares left over from the charm pack that I didn't use, and these are going to be nice to cut up and use as well. And I went to my scrap pile, and I found all of these little pieces that coordinate really nicely. So what I'm going to do is kind of a mashup of crumb quilting, quilt as you go, so all of our quilting is done while we piece it. And I'm going to use some yarns also at the end that I've had forever to do some couching over the top of it when it's done and give it some dimension. So once you have your fabric, your pieces, your crumbs that you want to use, and your batting all ready to go, you want to have it set up so that you have your little iron, if you can, on one side, and your sewing machine on the other side. Because since we're doing quilt as you go, some of these pieces are going to be too short to actually attach the way that we want to, and we'll have to do some improvisation and do a little bit of piecing the crumbs together before we can actually sew it onto our batting. Let's take a block, and I want this to be scrappy, so I'm just going to start cutting these up. And it doesn't need to be straight, just go for it and put it somewhere in the middle. I'm going to put mine right there. This is really just making it up as you go along. There's no plan to it at all. I can take this piece and put it here. You just want to make sure that you cover the edges of the first one. So this one will fit really nice right here. I'm going to take this to the machine and I'm going to stitch it right here. And just so I don't lose my spot, I'm going to pin it real quick. When you stitch it, you kind of want to go for a 1/4 inch, but it doesn't matter so much if it's super straight or exactly a 1/4 inch. The biggest thing you want to remember to do is cover up the raw edges so that you don't have any holes peeking through. That's what you really don't want in this process. I set my stitch length at 2.2 and I used my walking foot here because it's easier to keep the layers moving all together with the walking foot. You don't want the bottom and the top to slide apart. It just makes it a lot easier. So just keep in mind that you want to make sure that all your raw edges are covered when you sew. It doesn't matter so much if your stitch is straight or if it's exactly a 1/4 inch. Just make sure that there are no holes. So that's our first little piece. Take it over to our iron. I'm going to scooch mine over so that you can see it. So then we want to go to the other side. Let's flip it. And since I already used black and white, I think I'm going to take one of these. So let's actually cut this in a few little pieces here. That it's all jaggedy, doesn't have to be straight. Don't worry about precision. So we can piece this one with maybe one of these when we need one of the longer pieces. So I'm just going to put this together and set it aside. But since this piece is the same, we can just go ahead and sew it right there. As we get further and further out, though, we're going to need longer and longer pieces, which is why we're going to have to piece them first. Let's take a piece of this color. And we'll sew this one right here. And I'm going to pin it. Now you can kind of see how the pieces that we're going to use now are going to have to be longer and longer and longer as we go out. So we're going to have to match it up at this point to make sure that we don't get any holes. So here we're going to trim off this little piece and use that one again. And up front, it takes a little bit longer to do it this way because you do have to make sure that your pieces are long enough to cover and as you go out. But the neat thing is that your quilting is all done when you get this piece done. All you have to do if you're making a tote bag is cut it, square it up, and then make your bag. And you're going to put a lining on it, so you're not going to see all the stuff on the back anyway. And if you're making a quilt, then all you have to do is cut a piece of fabric for the back and do your binding as you normally would. So there's a lot of things that you can do once you get a block done, and it can be any size that you want. Just keep adding strips and piece them together when you need to, and keep sewing them down and pressing as you go, and your block is done before you know it. And what I'm going to do is just line these up this way so that I can sew them like string piecing, and then it'll save a little bit of time. So now I'm just going to cut them apart. This one here. But you get the idea. Just keep joining little pieces. When you attach them, they'll be on the batting. So then your quilting is all done. And just keep going until you fill whatever piece of batting that you cut out. Now that I've finished doing all the crumb quilting and it's all sewn to the batting in the back, I'm going to trim it by turning it over. And this part is going to get lined so the threads aren't going to show. But just look for where your batting is. You can see through the thin muslin where it is. And then just trim off the edges. I've trimmed off the edges and squared it up, and this is what we've ended up with. I'm using a monopoly thread from Superior Threads for the zigzag stitch to tack down the couching on the top. And it's a very fine see-through thread that doesn't show up on the final stitching. I've had the best experience with this one because it doesn't tangle up as much. The sparkly thread that I used is Razzle Dazzle. That is also from Superior Threads, and it comes in a lot of really nice colors. And then the yarn is just craft yarn that I had in my stash for a while. I think I got this at Joann's a long time ago. The foot I'm using is made by Creative Feet, and it's called the Pearls and Piping Foot. It has a little ridge in the middle so that your yarns fit right there, and it makes it so much easier to sew. You want to make sure that you set your stitch on a zigzag, and you might have to experiment to find the exact width that you need for the yarns that you're using. And I'm just taking the craft yarn and twisting it up with the Razzle Dazzle sparkly one just to give it some bling and some shine. And just work your way around. It doesn't have to have any definite pattern, just whatever you feel like doing. If you want to outline a shape first and follow that on your fabric, you can do that. I'm just sewing it down in kind of a wave across the fabric, and just so that it's not a straight line, and just twisting as I go. No particular pattern to it, and just rearranging the fabric as I need to. In the middle, I just use the yarns without the extra shiny blingy thread, just to give it a little bit of contrast, something a little bit different. So here it is all done. What I did was I squared it up and I put some black fabric on the back and just stitched it around the edges with a stitch length of 4 just to hold it together, and now it's ready to do some binding on it. I hope you found some inspiration today on maybe a different way of using up your scraps and doing different ways of crumb quilting. So I'll see you next time in the next video. Thanks for watching.